So good afternoon. I'm Randy Kearns, your professor for 4450 and 5450. This week we'll be covering tornadoes and access functional needs dealing with vulnerable populations. So again, just some of the highlights of things that are coming up. Let me be sure I'm sharing the correct screen. So things that are due for this coming week, a couple of independent study courses, IS 368 and IS 319A, and then there's a quiz related to tornadoes. And then aside from that, there's also a forum, discussion forum that you need to participate in. There's also a video related to splinting. Again, normally if we're doing a face-to-face course, a part of that would also include some skills in terms of understanding splinting, how we would do that. We're going to push splinting to the end of the course, as well as some of the other skills, and we'll talk about that a little later. But again, let me go ahead and get started with our presentation for today and be sure and narrate that just a little bit. So let me change my screen share to this one. And then let me go back to here. Well, sorry. Okay, so let's go and get started. As far as tornadoes go, right now we're actually heading into the potential for another peak season. The last time we saw a cycle of tornadic type activity like appears to be on the horizon for us for the next 3 months equates back to some of the things we saw in 2011. And I'm just repeating what meteorologists and they're just repeating what's being said by the National Weather Service and specifically NOAA. So the reason that's important is the 2011 tornadic outbreak over about a 3-month period was some of the worst that we've seen in a 50-year cycle. It was also my last deployment to an actual disaster with FEMA. I've been to a couple of disasters since in a different capacity, but I do have some highlights of lessons learned and what are things that we can take away from, again, understanding how tornadoes are formed, what type of risk that we may associate with tornadoes, and then what are ways that we can protect ourselves and protect others. So again, I want to be sure and go over the basics. I do have some examples. DR 1973, as I say, is a disaster that I was one of the responders to. And then DR 1971 actually occurred just before 1973, but it was granted as an extension of another series of tornadoes that had come through Alabama, specifically impacting the Tuscaloosa area. If you know anything about the University of Alabama, it's based in Tuscaloosa, and they had some substantial damage there. Had some slight damage prior to the Georgia tornadoes, and my deployment was to Georgia, but it was while I was at Georgia that we wound up reassigning some of our task group members to Alabama, and I have some of the content from both our recovery efforts in Georgia as well as those in Alabama, and that includes lessons learned from those experiences. And so the basics, column of air, and I do want to be sure and differentiate between a tornado and a microburst. The best way to think about a tornado is, again, it's a quick rising column of air that moves into a circular fashion, has a great deal of intensity, or it certainly can have a great deal of intensity, but it's really very narrow. we don't want to confuse that with a microburst, and a microburst is basically a straight line wind that's moving forward out in front of a large thunderstorm or a cold front that may be moving into the area, with, again, storms that are a part of the front moving in. And while there's not substantial difference in terms of the damage that could be created by an EF0 or an EF1 and a microburst, by the time we get up into some of the more intense storms, an EF2 through an EF5, and when I talk about an EF, the enhanced Fujita scale, where we're talking about miles per hour of wind speed at the core of the storm. And again, because these storms are really small, really tight, compact, you could literally live 100 feet away from the path of the storm and not have substantial damage. And yet, if you're immediately in the path of the storm, have your entire home blown away. And so again, I do want to point out some of the safer areas to be in as we talk about some of those things. Just understand the greater the number, the greater the intensity of wind speed, and the greater the intensity of wind speed, obviously, the greater the corresponding damage that goes along with that. And again, it's cold and warm air masses colliding. As they collide, it can build this upward funnel. Here's a better way to look at it. So as you've got warm air rising, cold air rapidly descending, it creates, again, this circular type pattern in this funnel cloud, and can cause substantial damage. Areas of the country that are far more prone to outbreaks of tornadoes than others. Again, there's some area in the Louisiana, the Baton Rouge and over toward Lafayette and Alexandria, but more so Mississippi, both around Jackson and up toward Memphis and southern Tennessee, northern Alabama, northern Georgia, to a lesser extent over into the Carolinas. But the areas that are more likely to be associated with Tornado Alley are an area we refer to as Tornado Alley, which is Oklahoma, Arkansas, to a lesser extent Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri. And then there's a second area that's quite prone to it, the tri-state area between Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. But again, tornadoes are fairly unique to North America and fairly unique just to the United States. Although they have been spotted on other continents, because of the geography and how weather patterns form across the United States, specifically across North America, we're far more likely to be at risk to or tornado than any other part of the world. And here's another actual tornadoes, 1,000 per square mile. Again, it just highlights the area that Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and southern Kansas are far more at risk than most of the rest of the country. Although, again, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi certainly are at risk. And then here's, as I start moving into talking about experiences from 2011, again, 2011 was the last really substantial outbreak of tornadoes that we've seen here in the U.S. And again, that's part of the concern that we have right now in terms of the preliminary data for the month of March continues to show, and then some of the prevailing weather patterns in the Pacific that's influencing that continues to have a similar look to what we saw in 2011, thus the concern. So if we look at the outbreak of tornadoes, the next slide coming up. So this is kind of a timeline of how over about 60 days, we saw literally nearly 1,000 tornadoes. 46 April 4th through the 5th, 59 April 8th through the 11th, 177 April 14th through the 16th. And then really the large outbreak was April 26th through the 28th, 343 tornadoes. And again, if we think about how substantial they were, how much damage they caused, and again, what were some of the lessons that we learned from those, that'll be information that I have coming up. And then tornado deaths since 1875. If you'll notice, there's spikes really about every 10 years until the 1930s. The 1940s, not quite so prominent. One spike in the 50s, one spike in the 60s, and one spike in the 70s. And then that was pretty much it until 2011. And again, just understanding how catastrophic some of these events have been, it does remind you how cyclical some of this is. Now, I will tell you, the actual outbreak of a tornado, the actual occurrence of a tornado, that really hasn't declined over the last 150 years. The reason that we see far fewer deaths today than we saw in the 40s, 50s, and 60s has far more to do with how substantial houses are built, how substantial buildings are built. And so, and it also points to the fact that the 2011 outbreak of tornadoes over 2 months was really substantial in the fact that despite all of the advances we've made in improved construction, improved safety of construction, there was still some substantial damage leading in and catastrophic loss of life in a number of states. The Joplin tornado, Joplin, Missouri, that impacted a hospital was one of those. So let me go through the Georgia example just simply because these are actual briefings that I conducted for leadership that was a part of the FEMA response to the Georgia tornadoes. And Georgia is a state of approximately 150 counties. A county in Georgia and most of the country is equal to a parish here. And as you'll notice, there's kind of a swath area. And this is actually in and around the greater Atlanta area. My mission assignment was in Atlanta. And although we did have another swath of tornadoes came through this northern Georgia area, and then right here in this corner, impacted Tennessee and actually impacted, this is South Carolina here, and this is North Carolina here, and this is Tennessee here. So there was some carryover damage into each of those states. And actually, this is Alabama here. There were a number of deaths and injuries in Alabama where the storm system came from. And just as also a point of clarification, DR 1973 GA is a unique identifier for a major disaster declaration that's specifically for Georgia. Earlier, I mentioned the Alabama tornadoes were DR 1971. That's because they actually got a declaration before the Georgia tornadoes. And so that would have been DR 1971 AL. Because each state is unique in terms of how, from a federal government standpoint, we're going to reimburse some of their expenses. That's why each disaster declaration is broken up by state. And so each federal response is also by state. Because at the end of the day, the people responsible for the disaster, the people responsible for managing the disaster, it really starts at the local level and then may escalate to the state level. By the time the federal government comes in, the federal government is not a first responder organization. Our job from a federal standpoint is to support the state activities and to support local activities. What do you need? How can we help? Where can we get resources from? And simply because the federal government has far more resources than any other state government does, it's a lot easier for us to call in, again, National Guard troops if that's what's needed, active duty troops if that's what's needed, but certainly an array of resources that are outside of what's available to the state. But at some point, the federal government packs up their stuff and goes home because the state government is ultimately responsible, and they're the ones that are going to lead those efforts. And so earlier we've talked about how we, and later on there's a recovery presentation. Just we primarily divide recovery and the things after the response up into two groups. Individual assistance, how do we help homeowners, people who may have lost part of their home or had some damage. And then PA, public assistance, how do we support the infrastructure, whether bridges washed out or damaged or destroyed. How about the public water, public utility system? So there's an I designation and a PA designation. So these are the I counties that were designated. And so again, we broke it down on a county by county basis. We went into each of those counties, did briefings for public officials, basically told them what they were eligible for. And then PA activities also went into each of the designated public assistance counties and told them what they were eligible for. And then worked with them to be sure that they recouped as much reimbursement as they could. Again, from a federal standpoint, the federal government has a much larger checkbook than local communities and local counties. So how can we help them minimize the impact of what's happened to their county because of this disaster? And then the one thing that happens, so the short-term recovery is really helping individuals and helping public governments in the immediate aftermath of a disaster to help them recover. So that's really short-term recovery. There's something called long-term recovery and mitigation, where we look at not only what happened and can you fix it back. The second piece we look at is how do we build resilience in the community and help the community build resilience so that going forward. I've got some slides that I'm going to come to shortly to show you how in the future, as we build something back, we look to make it more resilient. And particularly as it relates to public buildings, and we talk about public shelters, being close to softball fields, things like that. How do we build a public shelter so that if a tornado alert siren goes off and people, where can people go that is a safe place for them to go? So again, I've got that coming up in just a minute. This point actually ends that part of the presentation. Now let me move to some of the impacted states from, again, the 2011 tornadoes. This is some information that we received from Arkansas, again, as a part of our much larger federal debrief that I want to show just, again, a couple of examples of lessons learned. This kind of gives you an idea of the size of, so this is Alabama. Let me go back. I've got Arkansas, I've got Alabama. Okay, so actually the next set of slides comes from some of our experiences in Alabama and some of our lessons learned. And again, in terms of taking lessons learned and translating them into what can you do to keep yourself safe and to keep your family and your business in a position of where it's easier to recover from the disaster. That's the aim of it. And then the number out beside of the state is the number of deaths that occurred because of those early tornadoes. Now, later on, there was actually a greater number of deaths that occurred in Missouri, but this is, I think, as of the end of April. So this is Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Size of the storm was about 1 mile wide, which is really very large for a tornado. Tornadoes typically aren't that large. This gives you an idea of kind of the swath of damage and destruction that took place. And this is near Birmingham, which is not that close. Is not close to Tuscaloosa. It also reminds you that there were storms that came through in different parts of the state about the same time. I've got a picture coming up of an industrial facility, just to again give you an idea of some of the damage that occurred there. A neighborhood, you know, if that was your home, where in that home would have been a safe place for you to be? And so that's really what I want you to think about as we go through some of these images. If that was your home, what's the safest place in your home? And typically it's under a stairwell, or it's a closet in the center of the house, or a bathroom in the center of the house. But again, we'll talk about those things in just a minute. The other huge risk that I would encourage people to think about when you see a scene like this is the number of power lines that are down. Just understand early into this event, it's going to be hit and miss whether those power lines are energized. And so you really don't want to get close to one of them, because if it is energized and you do contact it, it could very well claim your life. Another piece to this is to remind you that trying to ride out a tornado in a car or in a vehicle is a bit problematic. There are safer places to be, but just understand, if you're driving down the highway, your best opportunity is to evade or avoid the path of the storm. Some people get somewhat mesmerized by the storm and are actually attracted to it and drive toward it. I don't fully understand that mentality, but I just know that there's enough scientific evidence to show that's occurred. I would encourage you to quickly and abruptly move at a direct angle away from it. Anyway, we can talk about that in a minute. Debris across the highway is a bigger issue. Again, this is not going to occur as the storm approaches, but it will occur after the storm has passed. And so a part of this is to help you understand that there will be a challenge getting responders to you to help. So your first responder is you. What can you do to prepare yourself, and what can you do to put yourself in a position that you can survive the storm and provide self-rescue and buddy rescue to be able to help yourself and to help someone else. So the mitigation assessment team, I was a part of the MAT response in Georgia, and that's a part of the briefing that I'm going to do here in just a minute. I was not a part of the MAT response, the mitigation assessment team in Alabama, but I do have their information, and we were a part of a joint briefing, so I do know the information they presented. Ringgold is a part of Georgia that's up closer to the Tennessee state line. And again, I've got some images to give you an idea of what are maybe some well-known beliefs that may be somewhat misconceptions as well. So this is Smithville, Mississippi. Again, this is a part of the storms that wound up coming across Alabama and into Georgia. Again, as you look at that damage and destruction, you can tell where the center path of the tornado was here. And then this part of the neighborhood was on the outer band of the storm. This is further out, and this is further out. This is the center line of the path of the storm. And so if this was your home, or this was your home, or this was your home, do you have a place in that structure that you could survive until hopefully people are able to find you and dig you out of it? Again, the whole point is to be able to survive the immediacy of the storm, and then again, that what's next type approach. This is Pleasant Grove, Alabama. The main point to note here is the path of the storm traveled in this direction. And there was some damage over here, but you'll notice the path of the storm is primarily here. And then this is back to Ringgold, Georgia. I've got, so this is obviously just the foundation of a home that was left. These are just foundations of nothing being left of those homes. And so again, it gets back to what type of construction do you have? Something I'll mention in just a minute and go into a little bit more detail is, do you have a safe room? And if you have a safe room, or do you have some type of storm shelter in your home? What would be the safest place that you could be in your home during a storm such as this? So the whole point of the MAP program is, again, we have embedded engineers that look at what caused the damage, how much damage occurred, and then what are things that could be done to help homeowners survive that type of impact in the future. And then again, what type of construction material should be used, what type of construction methods should be used. And it does influence some building codes and FEMA guidance documents. Again, how buildings should be built. This is a little bit more of where the storms came through. So we've got Birmingham here, Tuscaloosa here, and then the second series of tornadoes that came through just to the north and west of Huntsville, Alabama. And again, this carried into southern Tennessee, and over here is Ringgold, Georgia, and then Chattanooga. But most of the damage was right here in northeastern Alabama and northwestern Georgia. And then there were also a series of storms that came just north of Atlanta. There was also some damage south of Atlanta. I don't see that in this, but I know it was there. I spent a couple of days down there. So we've talked a little bit about this. So in terms of critical and essential facility performance, this is a fire station in Alabama, and it reminded us one more time about how, again, sometimes we build structures with the intent of keeping the rain out of the building. We typically don't think a lot about holding the roof in place and attaching the roof in a way that it, we think about the roof more in the context of just securing it to the rest of the structure. We don't think about tie down straps as much as we certainly should, as much as this would indicate. The main thing this tells us is, obviously there was structural collapse, obviously there were structural design flaws, and the real challenge here is the first responders can't respond to help you if their station has not been built in such a way that it can protect its apparatus and for that matter, protect the firemen inside. This is a fire station in Tuscaloosa. Did not include a safe room. The Emergency Operations Center, though, is the facility itself was constructed to, there's a FEMA standard for compliance for wind damage and wind resistance. And this is a structure that was built to withstand it, and certainly withstood any of the, although it was not directly impacted, it was there was secondary impact there, but it was not directly impacted. The city of Tuscaloosa, this is the Emergency Operations Center. The important thing to remember is everything that was on the ground floor survived. Everything that was up on the second floor, everyone who was on the second floor had been evacuated down to the ground floor, which was structurally engineered in a way to create a safe space and a safe environment. But they did not believe they provided that protection on this second floor, so to speak. They evacuated people out of it, and thankfully so, because it was substantially damaged. The other challenge is anytime a large storm comes through an area, it can take down radio antennas. Um, why that's important, certainly it's important for emergency communications, but it's also important for cell towers. If it takes down multiple cell towers, your cellular phone is just not going to be of any use. And because most of us today rely on cellular communication, it is incumbent upon companies like AT&T and Verizon to immediately move in mobile cell towers. But there may be an extended period of time where there's no telecommunication service available. School performance. So there was a lot of school damage, and I'm going to show you a school in just a minute that had a lot of damage. Most schools have a tornado plan, but one of the things we found was most schools did not have a safe room or a safe shelter. And where that could certainly be problematic. Again, I've got both schools and industrial facilities that tell us that obviously that's a big problem. So this was the school at Ringo Middle School. It just so happened the school was closed. I think it was closed for spring break, but the point was there was nobody at the school. But as we get a little bit closer, I've got some inside pictures that we took that again kind of reminds us our normal instruction of where to go and where would be a safe place to go, reminds us that we could have lost lives had that occurred. So that doesn't look terribly disturbing, other than you'll notice all of this wood here where the windows would normally be. And what that tells you is the direct impact here actually took most of the roof structure off and blew all of the windows out. And all of this glass became literally lots of pieces of projectiles. This was not tempered safety glass, by the way. So it was a very dangerous type environment. This was, if I'm not mistaken, the gymnasium, or it was an athletic building that was attached to the gymnasium. But as you can tell, most of that facility was damaged, and obviously was damaged beyond repair, but would not have been a safe place for people to have taken shelter. Yeah, the main thing this arrow is pointing to is that was a part of the hallway area. And then I'll show you another part of the hallway area that did not collapse. So this is the hall that did not collapse, but again, the ceiling was blown off of it. And the real concern here is frequently hallways are areas that we tell people to evacuate to. The real challenge though is the roofs had no reinforcement. There was really no substantial strapping that was done to secure the roof to the wall. And so what it really created was, it really, between the exposure to windows, those projectiles and exposure to all of this construction material that's going to be pulled off because it's not well secured. Again, fortunately, there was nobody in this hallway, but that would have been the typical place we would have told people, and that would normally be the safest place to go. It did cause us to reevaluate what are some of the things that we're telling people. In some cases, you're better off to be under your desk than out in the hallway. It just depends on the construction of your school and the construction of your major building. This school was built, if I'm not mistaken, early 1970s, and there was really no construction standard at that time that was designed in a way to help deal with and prepare for tornadoes. Yeah, so I've got a little bit of, I've got a few examples in terms of newer construction, 1990s to present, and older construction. And what we were really looking for there was stuff between the 60s, 70s, 80s. So this was a Wrangler jean factory in Hacklesburg, Alabama. There were 150 employees who worked in this facility. But because of the tornadoes on the ground and because of the forecast, and because they understood their building was not built to withstand that type of wind damage, the employees were told to go home. They closed the plant down and they sent everybody home. And so of the 150 employees that would normally have been on duty working in the plant at that time, only 13 were still in the building at the time the storm struck. And of those 13 that were there, 1 died. And as tragic as that was, particularly for that one person, had they not been proactive and understood the limitations of their construction and sent people home, they could have very easily lost many more lives. This is just another example of, again, commercial construction that really doesn't have a safe space in the commercial construction. Department of Family Services, again, just a typical metal type awning with brick facade and stud wall construction on the inside. We actually found a couple of voids in this building that probably would have been safe enough for people to have stayed in the building, probably would not have been able to quickly leave the building once the storm passes, but at least survivable voids within the building, and that told us space closer to the center of the building. Again, told us some of the same things we've said before. Smaller spaces such as closets or bathrooms are safer, but obviously if there's anything with a roof overhead, and in this particular case, a second roof overhead that's connected to the walls, it's connected to the floor, the more likely you are to be able to survive the impact of a storm like that. And this we just found kind of odd. It just, again, reminds you of just how much debris is flying. And this, this particular projectile came from, that's a piece of tube steel off of a porch, I think from this house, but it's stuck here. So it's tube steel. This is another piece of it. And I think it came off of this house, but we found it embedded in the dirt up here over this cutover. And again, just remind you of how much debris is moving associated with some of these storms. The refuge area at the Hobby Lobby, again, this was kind of their safe area, and I would have argued that that would be probably a safer area than part of the building, but any of these part concrete with a steel frame roof, it really depends on how that roof is tied into the walls. The main thing that we saw out of this was this steel reinforcement with an aluminum clad, probably aluminum clad roof is tied into the cinder block wall, and did create a reasonably safe void here for the people who were working at the Hobby Lobby at the time. Let me show you just a couple of pictures of residential construction. The main thing that we saw out of this is probably the worst place in the world to take refuge in a storm is if you have a bonus room above a garage. That's not a safe place to be. I don't care if there's a closet in it. I don't care what's going on there. And what's going to happen is the largest opening in this house are the garage doors. And whether you've got the garage doors open or closed, that's also going to be a fairly quick weak point of failure. And as the wind penetrates these door areas, anything above this garage, and obviously this was a bonus room here, really just disintegrated. And so it pressurized the house. And again, this bonus room, as they call it, above the garage, became a very dangerous place for anyone to have taken refuge. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the people in this home took refuge in a closet under the stairwell. If you don't have a specially designed safe room, that's exactly where I would tell you to go. If you have a closet under the stairwell and the stairwell's in the middle of the house, that's the best place to be. The alternative to that is if you have a bathroom that's also in the center of the house. We like to talk about being in a bathtub and pulling something over top of you, such as a mattress. The one thing, the caveat about that is newer homes today include fiberglass constructed bathtubs, and they're not exactly as safe as the old metal steel bathtubs that we think of as being much safer. But again, if it's the space in a small room in the middle of your home, that's still the best place it can be. Whatever it is, though, you don't want to be on the second floor of your home. The safer place is the closer you can get to the ground. If you have a basement, that's the safest place you can be. If you don't have a basement, the first floor. Let's see if there's anything else here that I wanted to point out. I do have so this is a safe room. Here's a couple of safe rooms, actually. Here's one and here's one. And the reason I point these out is, as you can tell, the entire home was destroyed other than the safe room. And the important point about a safe room is, again, if you're building a home or you're adding on construction to your home, there may be an opportunity to add a safe room. In a safe room, again, if you live in an area that is prone to tornadoes, and I'm talking about if you decide whenever you finish this program, if you're going to live in Mississippi, particularly over toward the Jackson area, or Oklahoma, or parts of Texas, I would think about designing, and I was building a home, I would think about adding a safe room to that design construction. The cost is not substantial during the time the construction is going on. And it's really about, so in this particular case, it's typically cinder block. The cinder block is a poured wall where they stack the cinder block, they interlace the block, they use steel rebar to tie it to the foundation, bring the rebar up through the cinder block wall, and then tie it into the ceiling so that it completely encapsulates the room. And it's encapsulated with cement reinforced with steel, and then a steel door, and the steel door has 3 deadbolts on it. Both of these, this one, I'm not sure if you can see that, but there's a deadbolt here, a deadbolt here, and a deadbolt here. This one on the inside of this was slide locks. There's a deadbolt here, but there was a slide lock here and a slide lock here. Again, you just need to be sure that your weakest point of failure is not a door being blown off. Okay. Other parts about safe rooms. So this is a FEMA funded safe room. It was not inside the damage path, but there were 150 occupants, people that evacuated to that place. And just, if you live in an area that's tornado prone, then you're more likely to know where the safe spaces are during the time of a tornado. You're more likely to know what a tornado siren sounds like when it activates. You're more likely to understand what are the things that you immediately need to know. If you are traveling in one of those areas, it's obviously going to be a lot more problematic. So I would just mentally be sure you're tuned into what's going on and where you're at and what type of risk may be going on. So these are community shelters that we found. This was Mississippi. And again, these are just larger versions of that same individual safe room that I showed you earlier. And this is just concrete reinforced. Actually, this is steel clad, if I'm not mistaken. So I think, yeah, I think this is, no, it was concrete reinforced. This is poured concrete with steel rebar steel bars on the inside of it. The steel bars are connected down into the concrete slab, and then the steel bars make a turn and go across the top and are connected into the ceiling. So you have an entire encapsulation of a building, and then you have 3 deadbolts, one at the top, one in the middle, and one at the bottom, and then 3 hard core, and then this is a steel door. I'm sorry, 3 hardened latches or hinges. And then here's another community shelter. This is Brookwood, Alabama. It's basically a community type shelter. And then these are located close to where the activity center, where the softball fields are. But the point is that people know where they can go, know how they can get into them. If I'm not mistaken, these are open and left open and left available. And then these are residential safe rooms. This is built more in the shape of an egg or the shape of a ball. These are fairly inexpensive, commercially found. And again, just gives you a safe space that you can go to evacuate to if you don't want to modify your home. And let's see. This is what the house looked like. This is what the room looked like. Individuals that were inside the safe room had to hold the door during the event, which again tells you that you may need to be sure that you have substantial latching on the inside of the doors. And then this is where they built a safe room as, again, part of a renovation to a house. Again, it's just a great idea to be sure that you can do that to create some safe space should you need that during a tornado. And again, here's the 3 deadbolts on this room. Now, on the outside, it's clad with siding, just like the rest of the house. On the inside is concrete and steel. And then here's one other one. Some debris did briefly trap them in this safe room in the immediate aftermath of the storm. And that's why I say, again, be sure you've got communication with you when you go into one of these. Although, again, if you survive it, you've got time to figure out how to get out of it. What else do I want to be sure and cover? So that's pretty much the extent of it with safe rooms and tornadoes. The last thing I want to hit is just a couple of slides on access and functional needs. And I'm talking about vulnerable populations. Who are the vulnerable populations? And then how do we provide access and functional needs for people during disasters? And particularly if you have somebody in your family who has access or mobility limitations, how do you help them during a disaster? How do you help them evacuate? What do you do in terms of, again, if you have a safe room, have you designed it in a way that allows somebody with a wheelchair to be able to get into it if someone in your family has a wheelchair? And then again, how do we help and deal with people who have, again, access and functional needs? And this is just some statistical data to give you an idea of how many people are impacted. Quite honestly, we understand how much more impactful a disaster can be when it impacts an area where people have the least financial means to be able to recover on their own. And a great example of that was Hurricane Katrina. It was far more impactful in areas where people are poor and live paycheck to paycheck, and immediately were cut off from the ability to earn an income. Yeah, let's see. So I talked about the people in Hurricane Katrina, tornado alerts. people with difficulty hearing. Again, just think about what type of functional needs or what type of vulnerabilities people may have that are either in your immediate family or work for you or a part of your organization. And there are a number of different definitions, but primarily we're looking for how we provide care or communicate with. But the aim is to help people maintain their personal independence. What else do we need to say about this? I do have a couple of slides here for informational purposes. Population-based definitions. In terms of planning for people who have access and functional needs, it is important to understand, and I get back to Hurricane Katrina, there were over 100,000 people who didn't evacuate because they had no means of transportation. You know, for people to be able to evacuate a city, you have to be able to provide them with and support them in their ability to evacuate. And that's quite problematic. Now, it's vastly better today than it was in 2005, but it does remind you that there are tens of thousands of people who live in the greater New Orleans area who live paycheck to paycheck or who live whatever income they may derive, and have limited options in terms of how they could evacuate an area. So that has to weigh heavy in the planning process in terms of how we help that particular set of the population, as well as anybody who is suddenly in need of evacuating and doesn't have the means to be able to evacuate themselves. Yeah, there's a couple of programs that are out there that are available that are linked as a part of the presentation for today. There are federal agencies that are involved in this response, and then here are some of the resources that are there. And with that, I'll say that's all I have for today. Do you have any questions? So what I would tell any of you, again, as you're watching one of the videos, if you see something that you have a question about, be sure and send me an email. If you're not watching it at the time that I'm doing the broadcast, certainly I'm doing my best to be sure I cover the content and the details that you need to know, both for a quiz, but more specifically to be able to protect yourself. The biggest point that I can make again is some of the old nuances that you may have heard in the past in terms of opening windows or closing windows, or what part of the house to be in, the southwest side of the house, or stuff like that. We've pretty much thrown all of that away. Our main aim today is to tell you to find the sturdiest place in your home. Hopefully that's under a stairwell, or it's a small room as closer to the center of the home as it can be without windows. That's going to be the safest part of your home. If you're in a mobile home, you need a plan that does not include you staying in that mobile home during the threat of a tornado. Mobile homes or manufactured homes are not built to withstand direct impact by a tornado, or for that matter, a substantial microburst. So it's affordable, inexpensive housing, but it's not safe in that type of environment. So be sure that if you live in that type of housing, be sure that you develop a personal plan of where you would go and how you would get there at a moment's notice if you need to evacuate. Okay, and with that, I don't have anything else. I hope you have a good day, and until next week, I'll see you on Zoom right here.